You know, I've been thinking. Back in 1973, the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons was published by possibly the world's biggest weeb ever. Gary Gygax was a man who was so obsessed with his Eastern fiction that even before the likes of modern VR and Sword Art Online, he decided he wanted to be a real part of this anime world. Historians suggest the main driving factor behind this decision was probably waifus. Gygax's favorite bit of garbage was a more modern work, by the name of Lord of the Rings. This was the spark that really made Gygax leap into creating his own manga series. The world would never be the same. Gygax's obsession soon spiraled out of control. Seeing that he didn't have enough capital to actually fully animate his dream, Gygax and his partner in crime, Don Kay, immediately began writing and illustrating their first official series, Cavaliers and Roundheads. Though, with little marketing, the sales were poor and the two were forced to look for more options. Don and Gygax soon had to accept the help of a publishing company, Brian Bloom, which invested just enough into their product to keep it afloat. This allowed for the full production of their dream, a series called Dungeons & Dragons. The first commercial version? A full box set, released directly out of Gygax's home in 1974. The stock sold out within the first year. Light was finally on the horizon. But tragedy struck when Gygax's best friend and business partner, Don Kay, died of a heart attack. Gygax and his publisher were then put between a rock and a hard place as the inheritor of the Dungeons & Dragons legacy fell to the late Don's wife. With no interest in their dream, the now widowed Kay dropped off all materials relating to their passion projects on Gygax's porch, and the business had to be moved to his basement, thus making Gygax the first basement dweller. Soon in 1976, the business moved out of Gygax's house and into their first production office. From here, Gygax wrote the well-known settings and side series known as Greyhawk, Eldritch Wizardry, and Swords and Spells. The story goes on, but perhaps we'll get to that in another video. Dungeons & Dragons has been a big part of my life for as long as I can remember. I was around 12 when I was first introduced to its majesty. You see, the idea of fantasy anime was appealing to me, as I was in middle school and obviously a fully functional individual with lots of friends and social connections. Most of you probably know Dungeons & Dragons from the anime, but only true fans like me will remember the manga. Though, I'll admit, I didn't get into the manga until the 3rd edition. See, I bet you didn't even know there were editions of the manga. You disgust me. So, here's how it goes. There are 5 editions. Let's just go through each of them in order. First edition is really showing its age nowadays. Most people refer to it as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This is because the first edition was so bad they had to release another version afterwards where they got the OTP right. D&D first edition had 3 characters: Fighting Man, Magic User, and Cleric. They were kind of in a love triangle, and in the end, Fighting Man ended up with Magic User instead of Cleric, and boy howdy did the audience call them out on their shit. This edition had 1 Tankobon. Most people probably thought it was just some H-Doujin or something. So they released a new version of the manga they called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This one had a few Tankobon right out of the gate. This was the one that came in a box set. The volumes had pretty badass names too. The Player's Handbook, The Monster Manual, and The Dungeon Master's Guide. Because of those catchy names, they really struck a chord with the youth fantasy market. This is when kids and teenagers were really starting to get into the story for real. To cap off the series, they released a full set of 14 Tankobon to really flesh out the series. The cast of characters was expanded some, and everyone got a full rename. Now, Fighting Man was just Warrior, Magic User was Wizard, and the Cleric was Priest. They even added a whole new character named Rogue. There was still a really shitty romance plot, but long-standing fans of the series didn't care. It was better than what they had had before, and they knew it. Plus, for added drama, they had all the characters have multiple personalities, because we didn't have enough shitty tropes already. For instance, Warrior had 3 different personalities with different strengths and weaknesses: Fighter, Paladin, and Ranger. I won't go too much into these for fear of spoiling stuff for you guys. I understand there might be some of you that still out there might want to start from the beginning after watching this video. Oh, and just as an aside, some people still think this is the best edition. Full nostalgia goggles. In the end, Gary found out that even the 2nd edition of his work wasn't good enough, and decided to keep on going with the revisions. You'll notice this is a recurring theme. They did eventually make an Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, but we're not going to get into that here, as its complete works are substantial, and they're not canon anyways, since Gary had almost nothing to do with them. You see, an eventual court battle saw Gygax leaving the company entirely in 1986. Dungeons & Dragons had become a commercial product, with no trace of its original creators. How good this was for the product was debatable. Some of you might not know this, but this is as far as the anime got. Some famous series such as Bleach, Gantz, and Deadman Wonderland were all made without a finished manga as well. It's a shame, but it's very common. This is why the ending of the anime felt so unfinished and like it just kind of stopped. Everything past this part in the manga was completely made up by those who took Gygax's place in the company, the most famous being Monty Cook. Next on the docket was to release the 3rd edition, simply called Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition, in the year 2000. Like I said earlier, this is where I got into it. 3rd edition blew up. D&D saw a huge rise in popularity among mainstream audiences, even though it was still considered weeb shit by some. This edition drops the whole multiple personalities bit altogether and just decides to make them all different characters. So now we have Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, and Wizard as our main characters. Quite an impressive cast for ecchi antics, wouldn't you say? And those are just the main cast. Long gone were the days of a petty 3-way romance. Now we had a cast full of characters with intermingling relationships and character traits. As the series wore on, though, it became bloated and fat with its popularity. Dungeons & Dragons had become a more commercial product, focused on making a profit. Whereas 3rd edition had launched with only 3 volumes of Tankobon, they soon released multiple spin-offs and side products. This wasn't helped by the eventual release of D&D 3.5 with even more books. By 2007, there were over 240 officially licensed volumes. Readers were promised to be kept entranced with the series for ages, but just then, tragedy struck. In 2008, Gygax would be diagnosed with a potentially deadly aneurysm. Though doctors would suggest surgery, their estimates for success varied from 50% to 90%. This lack of confidence from his doctor led Gygax to believe he was likely to die under the knife. In the end, he refused surgery. Gygax would switch from smoking cigarettes to smoking cigars. Gygax died at his home in March of 2008. He was survived by 6 children. Rest in basement, you beautiful bastard. But just then, like light over the darkened horizon, it was a new edition. Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was announced. In 2008, the first 3 volumes of 4th edition were released. Reportedly, some readers were angry at the limited time that 3.5 had been in publication. They felt their investment wasn't returned. We're just gonna start all over now and scrap 420 books worth of material? I was there firsthand. I can tell you of the Great Schism. Unlike previous editions, 4th edition had a yearly schedule that it set itself to. Every year, a sequel to the first 3 volumes would be released. This came as an upsetting realization to fans who had realized that some of their favorite characters weren't even included in the first 3 volumes. Several fan-favorite characters were missing, as a matter of fact. Barbarian, Druid, Sorcerer, and Monk were nowhere to be found, but there had been an addition to the cast list: Warlord. People were losing their minds. Some people even went as far as to start writing their own canon fanfiction. 4th edition saw a change in the fundamentals of the Dungeons & Dragons established world, too. There were now per-encounter powers and per-day powers, many of which had very specific effects. This led to distrust in the communities, as fans of the series quickly set out making maps and diagrams just to understand what they were reading. It was quickly discovered that use of these miniature-scale models, affectionately referred to as minis, were all but required to read their favorite series. Though the edition had an impressive initial printing, it failed to live up to the hype. 4th edition was all but dismissed completely by series faithfuls. The community would not go unheard, however, as 4th edition would be dropped by its publishers in favor of making a more faithful edition within 3 years. This is where we get to the present. As it stands now, Dungeons & Dragons is on its 5th edition, and fans are generally more or less content with the product. After a test printing in 2012, which I was a part of, by the way, 5th edition was fully released in 2014. We saw the return of our favorite characters, a simplification of the world that made it easier to understand, and the return of everyone's favorite husband-do, Dritz. We've seen a more relaxed approach towards updating and releasing new books as of late. Some actually consider it a bit of a drought. As of this video, there are only 27 books released, most of which are just books explaining the world and environments. Overall, Dungeons & Dragons has had a turbulent existence, mired with remake and remake after remake. Though to this day, it's still a fan favorite of many, and considered one of the best anime of all time. I hope this video has helped you get updated and comfortable with the series as a whole. Hopefully it has educated you a bit about the roots of one of the community's favorite anime of all time. Overall, I give Dungeons & Dragons the anime a 10 out of 10. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment below telling me your favorite parts of the manga and anime. What was your favorite edition? I'll be checking the comments as much as possible to discuss it with you. And don't forget to suggest things that you'd like me to review in the comments. I'll see you later, Space Neckbeard. Plus, for added drama...